So Albanian organised crime and its links to human trafficking is something that has been getting a lot of attention recently, in particular in the United Kingdom. We see Albanian criminals involved in human trafficking and people smuggling in a range of different capacities, from extremely sophisticated and organised human trafficking networks to looser, more informal operations. Now, for a lot of those people who are being smuggled, these traffickers are simply just providing them a service, getting them where they want to be in exchange for a fee. However, for many others, it represents a form of exploitation, whether they're being trafficked against their will or whether they're setting them up to be exploited in their operations further down the line. And then for a smaller minority, it is a way for criminals to travel around Europe undetected. Now, Albanian groups can be quite creative in their methods too. For example, reportedly, nearly half of all sham marriages prosecuted in the UK between March 2018 and September 2021 involved an Albanian national. And we've even seen Albanian and Italian organised crime groups cooperate to defraud the Italian healthcare system. And this involved getting Italian doctors and healthcare professionals to issue fake medical certificates, which stated that its holder needed to enter Italy to receive urgent or life-saving treatment. However, for the most part, people trafficking involving Albanian organised crime groups operates along much more traditional and established lines. As we covered in prior episodes, Albanian criminal groups have a significant history with human trafficking, and it formed a key part of their criminal operations when they were first establishing themselves in the 1990s. This is especially true of sex trafficking. So as we covered in our prior episodes, the trafficking of women and children became a significant issue in the 1990s, peaking between 1997 and 2001 especially. Albania was, and to a lesser extent still, is a source country for victims of sex trafficking and forced labour. Albanian victims face trafficking within Albania itself, but also across Western Europe and its closer neighbours in the Balkans. Often this would involve women accepting jobs in the nighttime economy of neighbouring countries and then being trafficked elsewhere upon arrival. And in other cases, we've also seen women forced into prostitution after being involved in arranged marriages. Now, this is often perpetrated by groups that are multi-crime oriented, so sex trafficking isn't their sole criminal enterprise, but it does play a key part, or at least certainly it used to when it was at its peak. Now, these groups would be fairly small. It'd be between 1 and 7 people responsible for sourcing the victim, arranging transportation, smuggling them across the border, and then putting them to work once they forced them into sex work. However, while this is still an industry that Albanian organised crime is involved in, it is much less significant than it was at its peak in the 90s and early 2000s. Where we do see significant Albanian involvement, though, is within the trafficking of migrants. And within this, there are 2 distinct roles that they play. The first is more of a supporting role, facilitating the trafficking of migrants into Europe itself, and the other is where they play a leading role in trafficking Albanian migrants into other European countries. So to start with the first one.
Predominantly from, the main routes coming from Africa to into Europe. You've got, first of all, into the Canary Islands. From just off the coast of Morocco, there's frequent occasions where boats of illegal migrants will be able to make the journey from that coast and get to the islands either independently or they're intercepted by Spanish Coast Guard. And further up, you've got from the coast of Algeria and Morocco. There's going across the sea there to the Costa del Sol. That's of course, a wide stretch of terrain. That's just one huge avenue of approach. There's also the Balearic Islands, so popular tourist destinations like Ibiza. After that, you've got from Tunisia and Libya. From Libya especially. It's a very well-established human trafficking route. These boats will set off from places like Zawara and Zawiya and head straight to Lampedusa. After that, you've got Adriatic, coming from usually Albania or the Balkan countries. They just go straight across the sea there onto the Italian coast, usually down in sort of south, like from Bari and further south, where you get to the very well publicized routes from Turkey going into the Greek islands, so Mytilene on Lesbos Island, etc. And these boats will set off from Turkey, and with the close proximity of the islands, they've got high chances of success. Those two routes, of course, filter into the well-known Balkan route, which, of course, also can also include actually going overland and going up through the Balkan countries. And from Turkey going up to the Black Sea. Now, this used to be quite a well-established route prior to the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. There would often be cases of migrants actually being able to stow away on ferries going from Turkey to the port of Odessa in Ukraine, and then they'd make their way through Ukraine and get into Poland. Final route that comes to mind, and this one's actually quite a concern, is a new route that was established would have been September 2021, if I remember correctly, where migrants just started flowing from Belarus into Poland, and these migrants were from Africa, predominantly Africa and the Middle East.
Now, historically, a key route would be to smuggle Albanian citizens across the border into Greece, which is the only EU country with a direct land border with Albania, and from there they would then smuggle the migrant into another European Union country, often Italy, via ferry. However, in recent years, this route is actually reversed, so migrants would be smuggled from Greece into Albania and then into Europe. And this is something that we saw, especially following the refugee crisis of 2015. Now, this predominantly featured migrants from the Middle East and Central Asia, as well as Southeast Asia and North Africa, especially Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Now, as Matt has explained, there are a number of different routes through which migrants enter Europe, but for routes involving Albanian organised crime groups, there are two distinct routes. The first is an older, more established route which involves travelling from Turkey into Greece, then across the Greek border into Albania, and then across the Adriatic Sea into Italy, and from there further into Western Europe. There's also a newer route which has been established in recent years, which is more overland. Now again, this follows the route of travelling from Turkey to Greece and then into Albania, but then instead of travelling across the Adriatic Sea into Italy, the migrants instead progress north on foot into Montenegro and then onto Bosnia and Herzegovina, into Croatia and Slovenia, and then further into Europe. Now in 2022, the Western Balkan route was by far the most popular route into Europe for migrants. Now this doesn't necessarily always include Albania, because often it travels directly through Serbia instead, but it is a route that commonly involves Albanian organised crime. So in the first 10 months of 2022, we saw at least 128,000 migrants enter the European Union through this route. So as I mentioned, the role of Albanian organised crime groups along this route is more of a supporting role. It's mainly organised by Kurdish gangs as well as Moroccans and Syrians. Where the Albanians largely come into it is they facilitate travel into Albania and then further through the Balkans. So as an example, an investigation by exit.al covered a typical smuggling route involving Albanian organised crime gangs. So for a fee of around €250 per person when the migrants are travelling in groups, or somewhere in the thousands of euros if the migrants travelling alone, Albanian criminals would organise the pickup at the Greek border, facilitate their travel through Albania, and then arrange their reception in the neighbouring country and help facilitate their journey further onwards, as well as facilitating payments. And often there will be a middleman based in a Greek city which would help facilitate all of this to be arranged. Now, as I mentioned, once the migrants are in Albania, they would then travel over the Adriatic Sea into Italy or onto a neighbouring Balkan country such as Kosovo or Montenegro, and from there travel to a European Union country. And like I mentioned, the migrants involved on this route are predominantly from the Middle East and North Africa, especially Iraq, Syria and Afghanistan. Get in-depth insight on the activities of Albanian organised crime. Transnational organised crime is one of the biggest threats to security in Europe today, and the Albanian Mafia is one of the most significant organised crime groups on the continent. Using open source reporting and data from the Intelligence Fusion Threat Intelligence platform, we'll be releasing a comprehensive report on the state of Albanian organised crime groups and their impact on global security. Sign up now to receive the report as soon as it's released. Click the link in the description below. However, Albanian organised crime groups play a leading role in the trafficking of Albanian migrants into other European countries, especially the United Kingdom. Now, in December 2010, the European Union granted visa-free travel to Albanian citizens within the EU as part of Albania's application process to join the European Union. So this means that Albanians have the right to enter a European Union country for up to 3 months without a visa. However, this is something that the Netherlands government actually challenged in 2019, as they were seeing Albanian criminals abuse this right when travelling through Europe. So for Albanian nationals wanting to travel onto the UK, getting to somewhere such as northern France is pretty straightforward. How they get from these countries into the UK is where Albanian organised crime gangs enter the picture. So traditionally there were quite a few different routes available to Albanian people smugglers wanting to enter the UK. The first is to travel by lorry into the UK. This could be from the port of Calais using the roll-on, roll-off traffic along the Channel Tunnel. It could be by ferry from the Netherlands or Belgium. Now, prices for these services could range in the tens of thousands of euros. So for example, according to a Balkan Insight report, the going rate for being smuggled onto a lorry and then into the UK from Calais and into Dover was between £13,000 and £17,000. Another route into the UK was through northern Spain. So in October 2022, for example, in a joint operation between Spanish and British police, an Albanian people smuggling network was dismantled, which was based in Bilbao and Santander. And as part of this people trafficking network, Albanian gangs would facilitate the travel for Albanians from the country of Albania into Spain, and then from there they would be smuggled either onto ferries or even freight shipping into the ports of Portsmouth or Southampton. Now, according to open source reports, the cost of this service could range anywhere between 3,000 and 15,000 euros. However, a recent development which has really caused a lot of controversy, especially in the UK, is the significant rise in Albanians travelling in small boats across the English Channel.
A third of all those arriving in small boats this year, almost 13,000 people, are Albanian.
So in 2022, at least 12,000 Albanian nationals are reported to have travelled in small boats across the English Channel. This includes 10,000 Albanian men between the ages of 20 and 40. For context, this is equivalent to around about 1% of the entire Albanian male population aged between 20 and 40. So for comparison, to sort of demonstrate how significant this rise has been, is that in 2021, around 800 Albanian nationals are reported to have entered the UK via this route, and only 50 in 2020, so it's quite a sharp rise. In a parliamentary select committee, Dan O'Mahony, who is the clandestine channel threat commander, attributed this to Albanian groups gaining a foothold in northern France.
So the rise has been exponential, and we think that is in the main due to the fact that Albanian criminal gangs have gained a foothold in the north of France, and they've begun facilitating very large numbers of migrants.
Unlike other trafficking networks, these groups are believed to be slightly more informal. Often they involve videos posted on TikTok as a form of advertising, quite often captioned with a 100% guarantee of arrival, with the price also included as part of the video, showing migrants travelling across the channel in a small boat. Now, obviously, despite the so-called 100% guarantee of safety and arrival, it's still an incredibly treacherous route, as demonstrated by the recent capsizing of a small boat in the channel in December 2022, which cost at least 4 lives. So, given the reputation of Albanian organised crime gangs and their presence in the UK, this wave of Albanian migration on small boats has been linked to Albanian criminals, often with the implication that the people travelling on these boats are criminals themselves. Now, there have been a number of claims that these Albanian migrants are exploiting modern slavery laws. This is something that has been stated in the UK media as well as in Parliament by the Home Secretary and in front of a parliamentary select committee by the Albanian ambassador.
The problem is that it seems that the people that are arriving here from my country, or I don't know, even from the, neighbors with Albania or Albanians living in EU or in other countries, they pretend to be victim of modern slavery.
So in 2022, more than 3,400 Albanian nationals have claimed to be victims of modern slavery, which is more than any other nationality, including Britain's. There are reports that police forces across the country, when arresting Albanian criminals involved in the drugs trade, are presented with a standard letter which claims that they are a victim of modern slavery in an attempt to avoid being deported and prolonging their stay in the country. However, some context does need to be provided here. So, for example, Dan Hobbs, who's the Director of Asylum Protection and Environment at the Home Office, testified to the Parliamentary Select Committee that
my understanding from the data we have available is around 90% of Albanians who go into the national referral mechanism get a reasonable grounds, which is the first stage, which is the reasonable grounds that they are a victim of modern slavery, and 90% may go on that have been concluded, but obviously there's about 450 days at the moment, so it's not directly related to recent arrivals. 90% are granted conclusive grounds that they are a victim of modern slavery or trafficking.
And this is where the lines begin to become blurred, because a lot of Albanians involved in criminal activity in the UK are subject to what's known as debt bondage. So this involves Albanian traffickers who have perhaps facilitated their arrival in the UK, accepting partial payment for their journey and then forcing them to work off the rest of their debt once they're in the UK, usually as part of their criminal enterprises. In terms of the small boats, it's also been reported that Albanian criminals based in France and the UK would pay the fare for the migrants to the groups operating the small boat crossings in order to have them work off their debt once they've arrived in the UK. Once these migrants are in the UK, they are often subject to threats and coercion, not always against their own personal safety, but quite often against the safety of family members back in Albania.
Se ti ke një familje këtu dhe normalisht do pash të që të thajnë ato dhe pagesat në Londër për ne janë pagesa sklevërie. Për mua është më mirë që ty unë në burg se sa ty familja ime në dhe.
So this means that even when an Albanian criminal does not appear to be under any significant immediate danger, the threat to their family's safety, which is quite often a genuine and real threat, which we've seen in the past, is enough to coerce them into carrying out criminal activity on behalf of Albanian gangs. Something else that also features in open source reporting is gangs in Albania targeting individuals who have become in debt to them in some capacity or are perhaps vulnerable, either young adults or children. So this is potentially borne out by the actual success rate of Albanian applications for asylum in the UK. So currently around about 55% of Albanian claims for asylum are granted in the UK, although it should be said that 86% of these successful claims were made by women who've been trafficked into the country. Another reason that they may be granted asylum is being involved in a blood feud back in Albania. So we mentioned in the first episode the revival of the canon, which is a tribal law involving blood feuds which can span generations. For example, if an individual's father is guilty of murdering someone from another family, that family may then seek retribution on the son themselves. So there are cases of individuals not being able to leave their homes for decades because they are part of an ongoing blood feud. So this is a reason, and a commonly cited reason, for Albanians seeking asylum in the UK. And then, of course, there is economic opportunity, which is a frequent driver of immigration towards the UK from people from poorer countries. So a survey in 2018 found that 60% of Albania's adult population wanted to leave the country. Now again, this could be not just because of blood feuds, but because of embedded corruption as part of the state, instability and crime, but also economic stagnation, low wages, and an idea of the UK as a destination where they can earn more money and have a better life. And of course, many are able to do this through legal means, but those who are unable to do so, don't let this deter them and go through clandestine and illegal routes instead. Well, it's been reported that migrants often don't wish to live in the UK full time, but instead will just travel for a couple of years before moving back to Albania.
And typically they may choose not to claim asylum, as Dan was just explaining, or they may claim asylum, but a lot of them are not actually interested in seeing their asylum claim through. They just want to get through it as far as they can. We'll typically put them in a hotel for a couple of days and then they'll disappear. They'll work illegally in the UK for maybe 6 months, maybe a year, send the money home, and then they'll go back to Albania.
All that being said, though, there is still a small but significant minority who are travelling to the UK with the express purpose of engaging in criminal activity and may be involved in organised crime. In fact, they've often already been deported from the UK previously, so there are a couple of examples. And these examples often crop up through arrest reports or people being convicted of a crime. So for example, a man by the name of Mauricio Miftaraj was sentenced to 15 years in prison over firearms and drug offences after police raided his home. Here they found 40 rounds of ammunition, gunpowder, £20,000 in cash. And what was interesting about this case is that Miftaraj had already been deported from the UK in 2015 after he'd served a 3-year sentence for firearms offences. So clearly he didn't let this deter him from returning to the country and was able to re-enter and continue his involvement in organised crime. And something else which has cropped up in reporting around the small boat crossings in particular is that Albanian drug gangs are using migrant camps in northern France, such as those around Calais, as a recruitment ground. So they'll be offering to, as I mentioned earlier, pay the fare for their journey into the UK, with the agreement that they would then go to work in their drugs operations in the UK. So these small boat crossings are reportedly controlled by Iraqi Kurdish gangs, and reportedly they run at least 80% of the crossings across the channel. Where the Albanians fit in is they act as middlemen for Albanian migrants, either within Albania itself or once they've reached northern France or Belgium, acting as facilitators and arranging transportation, getting these migrants a place on one of these boats. Now, in a report from the BBC, an anonymous senior French official said that there were concerns that Albanian groups would begin to start setting up their own border crossings, which might lead to clashes with the Kurdish gangs who have set up the existing operations. Now, personally speaking, having had a look at the typical way in which Albanian groups operate, I can't really see this being the case. Albanian groups would much prefer to work amicably and in cooperation with these groups, but there are increasing reports of Albanian-run border crossings. So recently the NCA, or National Crime Agency in the UK, dismantled a group who were running a so-called premium speedboat trip to the UK from Belgium. Now, while this would be twice the distance of the journey from northern France, the use of a more advanced boat would turn it into a 40-minute trip and be harder to detect because they'd be arriving in places which aren't the usual arrival points or departure points for the channel crossings. Reportedly, this cost around £11,000 per person and included access to a lawyer on arrival. As part of the way they advertised the service, the smugglers claimed that they would be guaranteed not to end up in a migrant processing camp. So, human trafficking is clearly a lucrative and important trade for Albanian organised crime groups. It's not just the activity of human trafficking in and of itself which is so lucrative for the groups. Yes, they can earn significant amounts of money, but it's the way in which it feeds into their wider activities that makes it so valuable to Albanian organised crime gangs. So to quote Tony Saggers in a report he wrote for the EMCDDA, the opportunity to utilise successfully smuggled individuals creates a constant pool of financially vulnerable individuals who can be recruited for criminal purposes such as drug distribution and cash smuggling. We've mentioned the concept of debt bondage and modern slavery, and individuals being trafficked into different countries in order to specifically work in marijuana plantations, for example. This is something that we're going to touch upon in the next episode, where we cover how Albanian organised crime gangs have used human trafficking to successfully corner the market in cannabis cultivation across Europe. We'll also cover how Albania itself became Europe's largest supplier of marijuana.